What is up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the OTK podcast, the show where we discuss anything and everything that is shaping the world today. I am your host, Caleb, and this is my beautiful wife, Desiree. And since this is an even-numbered episode, that means we're going to be talking about something having to do with faith and Christianity. And for today's topic, we are discussing the issue of pastors and their struggle with depression and suicide. This topic really came to the forefront here recently when a very well-known pastor in California sadly took his life, and it kind of rocked the Christian world in general. And so I thought it was a great topic to tackle, in the fact that you and I both have an interesting background in the fact that, I was in ministry and for a number of years. You were a children's pastor and you did ministry alongside of me in youth ministry. My dad was a pastor. My grandpa was a pastor. My brother was a pastor. We've seen a lot of the behind the scenes, the things that people are never going to talk about. And I know that sometimes we have the temptation to want to click out of conversations like these because we think, oh, well, you may not be a pastor or be related to a pastor. But I believe that as a congregation member, if you are a healthy Christian, you have a part to play in helping your pastor succeed and not become overwhelmed with the things that they struggle with. So we're going to split this episode into two separate parts. The first part is I'm going to go over some of the more practical things that I think a lot of people don't understand about the struggle of being a pastor. We're going to have 3 of those points to talk about. And then I'm going to have Desi kind of break down the psychological component of a little bit why it's difficult for them to get help, some of the things that a lot of people wouldn't consider when it comes to mental health and being in leadership and the influence that you have. So the first thing we want to go ahead and dive into are those 3 realities that I think a lot of people don't connect with. So first off, I think it's important for people to realize that most pastors don't have a lot of friends. And I think it comes down to the fact that it is difficult when you don't have anybody to talk to. We're going to cite a couple of sources throughout this podcast, but kind of the number one thing that stuck out to me was the fact that in a recent study done by Duke and kind of a joint effort in between their medical department and their ministry track, they found that the rate of depression was over 2 times higher in pastors than it was in the national average. And one of the things that they cited in that source as a reason was the fact that 58% of pastors polled said that they didn't feel like they had any real friends. And I know a lot of people watching this are probably thinking, well, most pastors are kind of the hub of social activity. How is it that they don't have any real friends? And I think it breaks down to the fact that you don't really have anybody to talk to about the issues that you're struggling with as a pastor, because the people you surround yourself with in the church, you can't talk about those problems. If you're having a fight with a board member, or you have a staff member you're struggling with, or somebody in the congregation who, you were helping through some issue and they relapsed, that's all things that you are putting at least your job at risk or the confidentiality of that person at risk by talking with people that are within that circle. And on the other side, it's difficult to talk to somebody that doesn't understand what you're going through. If you've never led an organization that has 100, 200, 300 people or more, depending on the pastor in the church, it's hard for people to get the weight that pastors carry on their shoulders every day. So, from your perspective, as you went through ministry, what was something that was difficult for you as far as not feeling like you had friends? Did you find it difficult to connect with people? What was your experience?
Well, I was listening to all the different things you had, and there's so many good nuggets in that. So hopefully I can target some things. Just from personal experience, I would say that it can be very isolating being a leader, whether it's in ministry, in business, or however that is, just because you're right, you're in this random zone of personhood where it's like, I'm not a staff member necessarily. I'm not a board member. I'm not a congregation member. I'm this one person in between all those things. I'm the glue that makes it all work out. And it puts all this pressure on you, whether it's real pressure or your own pressure, but it makes you feel like you have to be responsible for every aspect. So that's going to be isolating in and of itself. The second thing is people's perception goes a long way. So do they want to be associated with their local pastor? Like, Unfortunately, we are sinful people, so sometimes we don't want to be doing sinful things with a person who keeps us accountable. So a lot of the time that will isolate, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It just will happen. And then as far as personalities, I think as being leaders, sometimes there's almost a type where, believe it or not, there are probably more introverted pastors than extroverted pastors.
Yeah.
So thus, they don't, although they put out like they're very outgoing, engaging, like social dynamics, most of them, it drains them. It's not that they don't like it or they don't like the people involved. It's that they're introverted, they need their space to do their own thing, and that can cause the issue of feeling like you have no friends. So there's a lot of different dynamics in that, but I just know from our experience, we're both more introverted than extroverted, although you're very introverted. I'm kind of like borderline.
Somewhere in between, yeah.
Yeah, but yes, I think that has a huge impact. People don't want to be affiliated with the person that's going to keep them accountable. Introverted or just personality-wise, maybe that's just not your thing.
And I think what few people realize until you're in that ministry position is how much of the local church, the congregation-wise, is often related to each other.
Yep.
So it's difficult when, you make a friend, and a lot of pastors feel as if, well, I can't vent, because not only, let's say they're not related, but you run a certain risk of that person going to so-and-so. You don't know who's close friends with other people. Mm-hmm. And obviously as a leader, you don't want to talk badly about anybody, but it's difficult when you're like, I'm really struggling with how to connect with A. And then you find out, well, the person you're talking to is the cousin of, or the, great uncle or whatever. In small churches, especially board members, oftentimes the people deciding whether you get hired or fired or how much you get paid, often they got in that position because they are related or close friends with the most influential people in that church.
Yeah.
And so you struggle with, it's like, okay, who do I get close to? Who can I trust? Because I know we've had so many times in ministry where we thought we could trust somebody, and not that we were saying or doing anything wrong, just, sharing our thoughts on how to tackle certain issues and how to have certain conversations. And then that got back to people that it wasn't a conversation we were trying to have behind their back. It was just a conversation we weren't ready necessarily to tackle or didn't know how to tackle at that moment. And so I think unless you are a part of the culture, you don't realize how interconnected everything is, and everyone knows everybody else. And if there's something that's bad about church culture, it's that want to gossip and talk about people. And so the second you slip up and say anything that isn't a glowing review, oftentimes that gets back to the person
and I think,
immediately.
Yeah, as far as ministry goes, unfortunately, congregation members very rarely understand all the politics that go behind it. And I wish I didn't have to say that, but truthfully, there is a lot of politics, and you do have to be aware of how to stay on all the time. And so that can cause a lot of stress, anxiety, and potential for depression as well.
And the second thing that I wanted to touch on as far as a source of anxiety and a source of depression, number 2 would be the unrealistic expectations. In that same poll, they found that 52% of pastors said that the unrealistic expectations of the church and the congregation were a source of deep anxiety and eventually leading to depression. And I'll share a funny story that my dad tells me all the time. It's enough years past that I can't imagine anybody will get too bent out of shape. But he always talks about the fact that when he was a kid, he lived in a small town and his dad was the pastor there, and he was walking to the local arcade and he reached inside on his way to a phone booth, back when phone booths were a thing. And they used to have slots where you put in change to make a call. And then if you didn't end up getting your change back, or if you put in more than you needed, people would often forget a quarter in that little slot. And so he went and checked the slot to see if he could get an extra quarter to play at the arcade. And apparently by the time he got home, somebody in the community had seen him doing it, had called my grandpa and said, hey, every time that, your kid does that, it makes it look like the church isn't paying you guys enough, that you guys are poor and having to collect money off the street, and made it a really big deal. And I know that probably seems ridiculous and like that doesn't happen anymore, but we can tell you from personal experience that things that ridiculous happen every single day in churches. I mean, a number of places that we worked didn't want me to have a part-time job because they said that it made the church look bad. And it's like, well, the only reason I would want a part-time job is because, it's kind of a difficult thing because you want to try to keep appearances, right? You want to look like the church is trying to take care of you. And it's not just a financial thing. It's a family thing too, because it's so many people expect your wife to always be dressed modestly, and that's at the gym and the beach, and say the right things, and want your kids to be well behaved at dinners, and there's so many expectations not only on you but on your spouse and on your family. And so in these moments you have these okay, my kid is acting a little rowdy. Who's watching? Who's paying attention? Who am I going to hear a lecture from later? And then a lot of pastors I've watched over and over and over again are overly harsh with their wives, or with their wives, plural, like they have 6 of them.
Yeah, we don't do that.
Well, yeah, we're not polygamous. They are harsh with their wife or with their kids because they feel those prying eyes, and they know that this is going to be a conversation if they don't get it under control. And that really creates a lot of pressure. Those unrealistic expectations end up creating this environment where they're afraid to live. I mean, there's a lot of pastors that I've talked to that say, we just don't go out places, because you don't get to live the same regular life. If you get bad service, you're still expected to take it with a smile and tip the normal amount. And you know what I mean? While everybody else would say, hey, my food is cold, somebody was rude to me, I want a refund. You don't get to do that as a pastor. And obviously that's kind of a small thing, but when you have things within your life that are so drastically different than anyone that isn't a pastor, it really does begin to take its toll on you.
Yeah, unrealistic expectations is an external and internal thing. So you're talking a lot more about the external and the fact that people are always watching. We call it the fishbowl mentality in psychology, where all of a sudden it's almost like celebrity status, right? Whether you accept that or not, that is what it is.
The eyeballs of a celebrity and none of the pay.
Exactly. And the fact that you're right, it's almost like marriage, and the fact that when one person says, I want to do ministry, the whole family has to do ministry. And so it really has to be that family's decision, because you are under scrutiny. And it is because that's the gig, it's not just a vocation. I know a lot of people will say, well, some of them are bivocational or things like that. But truthfully, ministry is a lifestyle. It is something that is every day, 100% of the time. And so those expectations that people have on you, you're going to have to set boundaries as a family. I see it time and time again that ministers have a bad rap as far as ministers' kids. 50-50 chance. They're either the golden child or the devil's child. Yeah. I don't know. And it's a lot to do with these unrealistic expectations. That's what we're seeing in the studies anyway, of just if people are expecting this, kids have all of this pressure and they go one or two routes. They really try to people please, which ends up being negative anyway, or they're completely rebellious because they want out and they don't know how to communicate that well. The other side of the unrealistic expectation is internally. And believe it or not, ministers are humans just like everybody else. And we have insecurities. We have things that we beat ourselves up with. We have our own tapes that play in our head of all the things that, if you want to attribute it, although I don't really like giving our enemy that much power, but sometimes it comes down to that, where those insecurities are the unrealistic expectations and nobody else is putting that pressure on you, but you still do that to yourself. And that all feeds into this second practical suggestion of why pastors are more prone to depression and other things of that nature. And I think that when we can stop and recognize that first they're human, that goes a long way. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think you touched on the issue of being bivocational. And I think that if there was, they say that the leading cause of divorce is financial stress. And I would say, in my view of how ministry goes, one of the largest stressors and what I would assume is one of the leading causes of depression is that financial expectation, because ministry is the only place where your increase of responsibility does not reflect an increase of pay. You know, if somebody important in your church really pushes for a new program, or they want a new fancy whatever, or whatever it is, you then have to make a decision. It's like, okay, am I going to take over that program? Do I think that I can find a volunteer to do that? Because if I can't, because oftentimes the people making suggestions on what should be done are not the people volunteering to do the work. And so it's in most cases where if you were all of a sudden given 25% more work, you'd be given 25% more pay. But oftentimes you don't even have the luxury of pushing back for more pay because the church doesn't have it. Especially in the case of bivocational, the stress is that much higher because you're a pastor and no one looks at you as bivocational, right? If you ask a pastor, they say, I'm bivocational. It's a big thing to them. But you ask the average congregation member in that church, none of them will be like, oh yeah, my pastor's bivocational. Nobody cares about that. They expect you to do the same amount of congregational care. If I'm sick in the hospital, I expect you to be there. If my kid gets in a car wreck, I expect you to be there. That expectation not only is 24/7, but then you get these thoughts in your mind where, because I know that this was, a difficult thing for me when I was working another job and doing youth ministry. It's like, well, how much faster would my ministry be growing if I wasn't working this other job? And then it's kind of this chicken or the egg, because you think, well, if my ministry grew, I wouldn't have to work this second job. But my ministry is not growing because I'm working this second job. And so it becomes this issue of okay, do I try to push my board or fight my church for more money? Do I, more or less end up ignoring my family because I'm trying to take on all these extra responsibilities? Or what most pastors sadly end up doing is just getting out of ministry altogether because they can't afford to live life that way. I mean, it's one thing to not see your family when you're making a ton of money, right? Because then you can kind of pad it with nice vacations and all of these things. But when you're not seeing your family and you're broke, and people are still expecting you to act as if you're not broke.
Well, how many pastors would actually push as well? I mean, that would be really frowned upon, of saying, hey, why do you need more money? Aren't you supposed to be doing this because
it's a ministry?
That's what you're supposed to do. And I mean, these are really tough conversations to have for anyone. But in ministry in particular, it's almost frowned upon to say, hey, I need so much to survive, or this is how much my skill is worth. And it's just a challenge. But something we talked about even this week that might play into it is a lot of the pastors that I know are predominantly male. And men it is a need to work. I mean, it is part of their identity. And so when things aren't going well at work for whatever reason, and that being in ministry, that's a huge toll on them. And as a pastor, they're the shepherd. And for the psychological world, we might say they're that person's parent or the congregation's father in that sense. The Catholic Church, they actually say father. Yeah. And it feels like that type of responsibility. So those unrealistic expectations, they come from what could be realistic expectations, if that makes sense. Like, it's all of a sudden dysfunctional view of a good expectation that's been morphed into 50 million things. But yes, the bivocational, the financial component, the identity of being a good father figure, as well as just working well, doing things right, it's a lot of pressure.
It really is. So the third thing that I think is a really practical reason that leads pastors to such deep anxiety and depression is this issue of a personal reflection on themselves as to the success of their ministry. And it's really easy for pastors to look at, okay, how many people are coming on a Sunday morning? How many people are tithing? How many people are participating and volunteering and all of these things? One of the things that the studies talked about is the fact that you could track a lot of this depression and anxiety almost directly correlated to the success of the ministry, right? Because it's really deep lows when things aren't good, and it's really high highs. And so it leads to some really sad things. Like, most people don't realize, unless you're in ministry, that around, not obviously Christmas, everybody shows up for that service, but that, November, December, January, your attendance tanks. I mean, you go from maybe 200 originally down to 75 or 80. I mean, people are out of town, all of these things. And obviously, when you're traveling out of town, you don't think anything about it. But when people aren't there, people aren't tithing.
Right.
And in a lot of churches, if people aren't in the seats, if people aren't tithing, I may not eat this week, or I may not whatever. I mean, so many people think that, a pastor's on salary. He gets paid no matter what. He just to show up on Sunday. But the salary only exists if the people are there, because the tithe is then there. And so I think a lot of times pastors connect themselves so deeply with the success of their ministry. And it's not even just internal, it's external too, because there are going to be at the end of every 6 months, 9 months, a year, your board or whoever is in charge of you is going to come to you and say, okay, how much did we grow? And if you aren't growing at whatever percentage people have decided that they think arbitrarily you should be growing, you can end up losing your job. And so I think it adds all of this extra stress of, when you're supposed to be leading, and the times that are oftentimes the lowest attendance and the most difficult are often the times that require the most, what you should be giving time and attention to your family, the holidays, being able to relax, take vacations and all these things. But oftentimes they end up worrying about am I going to hear about it from my bosses because people didn't show up? Are we going to be able to meet our monthly budget? It cracked me up. I didn't really connect this until a couple of years ago. I walked into a church, an older church, and I noticed a board that said, last week's attendance, this week's attendance, and this week's tithe. And I remember being with an older pastor that I was friends with, and I said, what is that about? They said, they'll literally put up how much they got in last week and what their monthly amount is that they need to keep the doors open. And I laughed and I said, well, that's really weird. And he said, no, that's a very common thing all across the country, is that they're that desperate to be able to get in whatever funds they need to keep the lights on. They're literally putting it on a board in the back, telling people, hey, we only got this much that week, which means we may not be able to continue if we don't keep doing it. And so when you realize as a pastor that if I don't do well at my job, if we don't grow, I don't eat, church shuts down, you start, the catastrophizing that can happen mentally is astronomical.
Sure. Well, you think about depression as a whole anyway. It is so interconnected with identity.
Right.
So anytime your identity is in question or in conflict, it's going to spike up tremendously.
Yeah.
It's just human nature to be in that way. Just because you go into catastrophizing, you go into all of these coping mechanisms, whether good or bad, to try to figure out. Your brain is a natural processor. So whether your experiences have been good or bad, how you got through things in the past and has worked, whether good or bad, again, those are the things that you're going to use. So if you've got any history of family members that dealt or suffered with depression or suicidal behaviors or things of that nature, that's what you're going to experience. It's kind of that nurture versus nature component. Yeah. But also, sometimes it's a matter of brain chemistry. And if you are more prone to depression, you have to safeguard yourself. And being a pastor, being in leadership, the likelihood of you getting to the point where A, you can afford somebody to tell you.
Yeah.
Or B, you have to kind of put your pride down a little bit and say, hey, I might actually need some help. Those things, I'm just going to say it doesn't equal C. It's just one of those things that, unfortunately, they are probably the least likely demographic, minus therapists themselves, that will come in and get help. Just because of those are, I would say, the top two reasons. Not so much that they don't want to or don't see the need, but it really is a matter of finances, number one, usually. And then on top of that, just what is this going to communicate when I do ask for help?
That's good. And that kind of segues us I wanted to give you guys that aren't pastors kind of a behind the scenes understanding of some of the things that your pastor will never complain about, never say anything about. Because that's what being a good leader is not complaining about things despite having to deal with the problems that we talked about. But I want to segue to the second part of the show and just share some of your thoughts on what makes a leader more susceptible to anxiety and depression, aside from some of the really practical things, just from a mental stress position, as far as the fact that they are responsible for so many people, and the fact that like you said, if they do say, hey, I need help, the way that looks of so many people in the evangelical world that would say, oh, well, he doesn't have enough faith, he's not close enough to Jesus. To talk a little bit about when somebody is in leadership, just so they can understand, now that we've explained the practical, explain kind of the emotional and the psychological side of why a pastor would be so susceptible to problems like this.
Well, we talked a lot about it in the practical. I mean, personality-wise, who generally gets called into ministry is a very certain type. I'm not saying that various personalities, people with different talents, with different perspectives won't be called into the ministry, but more than likely, they're going to be people who will step up to the plate and will make hard decisions, will fight for things that need to be fought for. And that means sometimes not fighting for themselves. Pastors, ministers, missionaries, they are sometimes the most selfless people that I encounter personally. And so when you are so others focused, you tend to forget yourself. And I see that a lot in parents. I do family things, and a lot of the times parents will be able to identify all the things that are wrong, or at least they want to help their kids, and they completely forget that they need to be working on themselves. So a practical thing that I would say for those pastors out there is strategically plan out sabbatical times or self-care times throughout the year.
Yeah.
Put it on your annual calendar, because it is going to be something you'll have to plan. It is just part of the leadership part.
Yeah.
But also it sets a precedence of health and strength for your congregation, for them to see that you are making sure that, especially if you are prone to depression or anxiety, whether you've identified that in your teenage life or your spouse, and you have identified that in your marriage, or however that's been identified, please make sure that you set out the time, create those boundaries, and really just show. I think we have an opportunity, not necessarily as we want to be good role models. So we want to make sure that we are putting it out there the best way we can of what do other people need to do. And so please, pastors, take the time to go get therapy once in a while, get that tune up. I see a lot of couples right now, it seems like, when you're doing great work, when you're impacting the world, the enemy's not going to like that. And so you're going to be under attack. And again, I don't like putting a whole bunch of power in that conversation. But what I will say is, when you are doing great things, it's inevitable that something or someone is going to try to shake that up. So the things that matter most, family being priority, if you are your spouse, you need to be watching for that. But you were asking, what are some things? We discussed it, family history. If you know that either your parents, grandparents, siblings have had a history of depression or behaviors that were really dysfunctional, even self-harm behaviors, those are things that we look for as therapists to say, how are you coping with stress? How are you coping with life? Because life is going to hit you no matter what. So you have to be able to learn how to be resilient through those things. And when you're a leader, it hits first at the top usually. So you do need to make sure to safeguard yourself. I don't know if I answered your question. I kind
No,
of
you
went
did.
all
And
around it.
You brought up a good practical point that I wanted to give real quick to if you are a congregation member that has any level of influence, I would encourage you to find out 2 questions. How much time off does your pastor get? Mm-hmm. And how much is his Christmas bonus? Now, I'm going to be meddling because people aren't going to like you asking that question. But the reason that I encourage you, if you have swing and power, is because most pastors don't take vacations generally because they can't afford them. And they can't afford them because they're underpaid. But then when you talk about, I know my first Christmas bonus was $25, and that was less than 10 years ago. I mean, and most people, they call you up on stage, and this is kind of the behind the scenes. They call you up on stage and they make this big spiel about how appreciative they are of you and everything you do. And they hand you an envelope, and everyone sitting in the congregation assumes that you just got a check for $500 or $1,000 or whatever it is. And you try your best to have a good heart about it and say, it doesn't matter what the amount is. Sure. They're showing me appreciation. But the reason I say ask what it is because if it's less than $1,000, please get a couple of people in the church together and say, hey, we want to bless our pastor. We want to make sure that if he's going to get some time off, that he can actually afford to spend it. I mean, because if you have 3 or 4 kids, if you're going to go to Disney World, you're going to go to, wherever, you're talking about $2,000 minimum, even if you're driving, just to get a hotel and food and all of these things. And I think a big part of this issue of depression is just the fact that they want to take Sabbaths. I don't think there's any pastor that doesn't want to.
They just can't.
They just generally can't afford it. And so I would encourage you to take some responsibility of that. And maybe you can't this year. Maybe you find out that they get like $100 and you're not in a financial position. Look at just raising $25 a month. Do a fundraiser or something like that, because the pastor's never going to push for that himself. He's never going to ask for more. That's just his heart. But just try to take some personal responsibility for your pastor and encouraging him and pouring into him and loving on him. Invite him over, because he's usually the one having people over. He's usually the one entertaining. He's the one buying birthday gifts for congregation members, and he's the one going on and on and on. But before we wrap up, I would really love to hear your thoughts as somebody that was a spouse in ministry. What recommendations you would give to kind of a two for one special here? What recommendation would you give to couples in ministry to be able to keep themselves strong? Mm-hmm. And the other side of that is, what would you say to the spouse that isn't in power, right? They don't have the ability to change things, but they're absolutely expected to kind of roll with the punches and deal with the problems, which is kind of a part of the not having the friends thing is, I know I've struggled when there was an issue in the church. I knew she knew about it. I didn't want to bring it up when we got home again because she knew it was happening. She was struggling with the consequence. And so you can't talk to people at church, and you feel like you can't talk to your spouse because it's like you want your wife, or, if you're the wife in ministry and it's your husband that is the spouse, you don't want them to look negatively at the church. You want them to believe in that vision. You want them to buy into what the other people on staff are doing. So you don't want to come home and just rag on them. So what would you say as far as communication, those kinds of things? How can you help a spouse and how can you help a marriage?
It's a delicate balance because there's not really a separation of church and
marriage.
Church state. I mean, it really is an intermingling, and you have to do what works for your marriage. I wish there was this perfect formula I could give everybody, like this recipe and say, just get the 3 eggs and put it in the flour and blah, blah, blah. But I think it does look different for each couple. Just kind of like how the roles in a marriage might look different just based on personality or talents or skills or however that looks. So number one, I would say make your marriage a priority. Mm-hmm. Like, don't look out at others first. A lot of people say, it's God first, family second. Right. And then church and everybody else third. But I don't feel like people really implement that. It's a great saying. I'm saying we need to implement it. Yeah. Like, it needs to be a precedence of, if you need to have a family day or a date night or something where it's like, all phones are off for everybody else. This is our sacred time.
Protected time, yeah.
Do that. And I feel like this whole conversation, I have been like screaming out boundaries. So if you've heard nothing else, apparently that is for somebody. Put the boundaries in place and write those boundaries down so that you stay committed to them, because we talk a lot and we say we're going to do things and then we don't follow through because they're not in writing.
And I would say if you draw those boundaries and your board or your congregation members or your whatever can't respect those boundaries, you need to really prayerfully consider where you are currently, because what you need to realize is that if you leave a church, that church will survive. They'll find another pastor. Your marriage may not make it. It may not survive. The casualties of a marriage go a lot deeper than the casualties of a staff member being replaced.
Well, it's kind of like a family meeting. You never leave a family meeting completely undone. So when you set up those boundaries, you write them down, you discuss it with your board, you discuss it with the congregation members. Everybody needs to kind of know,
right,
so
aware.
that everybody's aware of the game plan.
Yeah.
And then you implement it. Go to marriage conferences once in a while, do devotions together. Anything to really nurture that relationship, that's vital. Because when you're constantly in conflict with the person that is supposed to share life with you,
right,
and battle the battles with you,
it's miserable,
yeah, you're not going to get through it. It's just not going to work.
And your ministry will suffer in the process.
It definitely will. It's like kids already know when their parents are fighting. So
your congregation knows when you're fighting.
They know.
It's the reality of it.
And sometimes they'll make it worse. So work on it at home, work at it with each other, have these difficult conversations. We shy away from conflict so much, especially in ministry.
Oh, yeah.
This is not the time to shy away. If you're really having issues, concerns, questions, if you're having those with people in leadership, your bosses, pastors, if that's a, board, or if that's, I don't know what else.
A district head.
District head. Have those conversations, because it will eat you up inside. I know that from personal experience. Like, I know how hard it is to have conflict, but we have to have these discussions. Yeah. It'll at least get you to the point where people are aware, they can keep you accountable. They can really be your friend.
Yeah.
Also, strategically find your tribe. I'm not saying have a 10-person tribe. I mean, Jesus alone only had 12, so 12 or less? No, really 2 or 3 people that you can 100% make sure are not your yes people, that you can divulge information. One of them, hopefully, could be a therapist. That'd be great.
Yeah.
But if not, at least make sure that they are your wise counsel and will really keep you accountable. I think that's essential for all pastors and pastors' spouses, whether being wives or husbands. You're right. Spouses are under a lot of scrutiny as well, and they didn't necessarily sign up initially for it. And I think just especially being like a pastor's wife, there's another level of expectation and things like that. I hear you. I really do. And I choose to say I'm going to redeem. In the midst of everything, I will redeem things. I will reframe things. I will fail forward. So as a human, I know I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm not going to hide. I'm going to try my very best to be the role model, the mentor, the person I would like to lead me to other people. And sometimes that means saying, I'm sorry. Sometimes that means saying, I didn't know, but let me get you somebody who does know. And sometimes that means standing up for your family. Yeah. But for sure, it means making sure that you don't belittle your spouse. I think so easily we can get in the midst of gossip and belittling just naturally, let alone being in the church. But it's never going to help situations to be that spouse. People don't need to see that. I'm not saying don't be fake. Like, I don't want you to be fake, but
just be mindful who you're being real with.
Right, exactly.
Or too real.
there's a balance of being too vulnerable, and as well as we have to guard our precious things. Our marriages are so precious, and like I've always found it extremely inspiring when I saw a pastor's wife genuinely admire her husband and his work. Like I could just feel my heart just want to burst out, because too much of the world breaks down their spouses. And I want us to be inspiring the world, not being worse than them. So
that's good.
Again, those are some of the tidbits that I would say for the couples. Just make sure to nurture and water the things that you want to grow. Anything you don't want to grow, you need to snuff out. Yeah. So I think that's important to just kind of keep at the forefront of your brain. And for all the congregation members, help your pastors have healthier marriages. If there's a way to fundraise for them to do certain things, that'd be a great way to do it. Invite them. You said, a lot of the time pastors are the hostesses, and let them be the visitor and just be loved on. I think that really goes a long way for leadership. They just want to be appreciated in the same way that anybody else would want to.
It's good. Well, we are all out of time, but I did want to give just a couple of quick thoughts. First off, if you are a pastor or anybody in leadership that is struggling with depression, that is struggling with suicidal thoughts, I'm going to include the suicidal hotline down below in the description. I will also include my email address, our email address, to be able to connect with us. We would love to talk to you, just be there for you. I realize that we don't know you, but we do love you. We care about you. We don't want you to make a decision that is going to impact your wife and your kids and your congregation for the rest of their lives. We'd much rather get you the help that we need. And I'd also encourage any congregation members, for every instance that you are tempted to fight for some new project, some new program, some new thing, I would ask that you fight just as hard for a fund to go for staff counseling. And a lot of times we think, oh, my pastor doesn't need that kind of thing, but I guarantee you they do. And counseling is not cheap, especially when you're talking about marriage counseling and individual counseling, all the types of things that people need. And it's not just about, oh, is he going to commit suicide? It's about, are we able to keep him healthy? Mm-hmm. Because the best way that he can lead you is by making sure he's in the right shape to be able to lead in general. So I would encourage you to reevaluate. If you are in a church, start a fund, say, hey, if you want to be able to go for 15, 20 sessions a year, we want to be able to bless you and help you do that. So thank you guys so much for checking out this episode. We did do a recent episode all about mental health in the church. I will make sure to link that down below so you can check out some more of that content. But if you would like to support everything we're doing here, it is patreon.com/OTKmedia. You can also follow us on all of our social media at OTK Media. We love you guys very much, and we will talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.